This is the map Inferno Labs that I created for my Game Design 2 class. This is a map that can be played on Quake. I created this as my final project for my class. When the player first wakes up in the map and starts out, uh, they're they're in a submarine. When the player starts off the game, the intended storyline is that they actually got knocked out by this crate right over here that they were unpacking stuff out of. And when they regain consciousness, the map has been evacuated and they've been left behind due to an attack on the base. Now, I wanted to kind of have an industrial feel to the submarine part of the map, which isn't really seen in the rest of the map. And this is due to the fact that I submarines are very industrial. Is a lot of metal used because they need to withstand high underwater pressures. I also thought it'd be a really cool idea to start off in a submarine. And I thought that actually, especially considering that this part of the area is an area of the map where the player is safe, that they are not susceptible to any attacks from any enemies, that a submarine would be a really good representation of that because it's sturdy. It has an enclosed space that that the player has a direct sightline to and can look around very quickly, letting them know that there's nothing around them that's gonna jump out and attack them. So when the player actually goes up, they see the submarine control room, and there's actually a piece of ammo here that I'll briefly talk about in a couple of minutes. But to kind of talk a little bit more about the textures, I wanted to add textures in here that had a control feel, where this is where the navigation is happening, and this is where you can actually start to see that there might be things going wrong. And this can actually be seen through these textures right here of the control panels. And I specifically chose ones that had flashing lights like these to signify that, hey, there might be a malfunctioning going on. So there are parts of the map that are intentionally malfunctioning. Players are not able to open doorways through buttons. Instead, that um, they have to shoot at buttons, and this is due to the lockdown that was happening to try to keep the rest of the map and the people who used to live there and work there safe during the attack. Clearly, that did not work out, but that's why the player will have to shoot buttons to be able to access doorways that have been previously locked. So the only way out of this area of the map is actually through shooting this button right over here. Just to mention on the piece of ammo right over here, that was supposed to let the player know that, hey, that they're approaching the area, that there might be a fight happening. So they should stay on the lookout to any enemies that might be in the upper area of the map. So this is actually the submarine docking run that the player exits out of. So immediately the player is going to be drawn to this staircase right over here that's closest to them. And there's actually, as you can see, dogs running out right over there, which are set off by a trigger event. So when the player tries to go up the staircase, they actually fall down. And that's to a loose floorboard that's kind of created for the storyline purposes, where there were certain damages happening to the base. I wanted to keep the damages low because again, was supposed to be an attack that only just happened. This base isn't broken down and hasn't been here for a long enough time for there to be a lot of issues. But as you can see, there are parts like the floorboard that's not working. Um, when the player enters this area, they can clearly see the dogs running through these doors right over here, which is actually a storage room and a secret area that the player is actually able to obtain a gun through. So after obtaining this item, there's only really one way out of this little part of the area that the player falls through, and that's by going forward. Now, when I previously walked out just to show you what the map looked like, you could see that there were actually pieces of ammo and health over here. Now, the player really is only able to see these after falling down and heading forward, and that's actually to draw their sightline to the staircase right over here, letting them know that they should go up this way. Now, when the player first enters this area, the sightline of these items are actually blocked by these crates right over here, so the player isn't going to be tempted to go out that way first and up the other staircase. These right here are the submarines I created to add to the map. I used similar textures in the submarine below that the player comes out of, but I wanted to keep these ones small, as in to show that this is a docking room, but also to not make it feel like the submarines are taking up a large part of the room. There's one more secret area in this map that actually can be found by hitting this button right over here that unlocks this doorway right here that takes the player to an armor that was actually left behind by construction workers, which is player finds out through the message appearing on their screen. So I spent a lot of time kind of choosing the textures for this map and figuring out how the lighting would work. I did want to keep most of the lights in this map pretty bright because I wanted to signify that this is a new base, that this has everything has been here working fine, even before and after the lockdown. There aren't going to be any loose light bulbs. There aren't going to be any really uh, lights that need to be replaced. This is a new base. Everything should be working fine other than the attack. I also just wanted to keep the area bright to make it easier to navigate. Now, there are parts of this map that are a bit darker, as you can see. So these are actually lights coming off from the submarines, which I actually added direct beams out of that go straight. So as you can see, this area is a lot brighter than right over here. And that area where the staircase is a lot brighter over here than it is over here, and that's because of the direct light actually going from the submarines forward, which is why this area in the middle is a lot darker because it doesn't have those direct light beams. Now, I actually had a lot of trouble figuring out the textures for the wall. Previously, when trying out textures, I did match the textures of the floor a lot to textures of the wall, and I had a lot of issues with that because it either looked too similar and there were no distinguishable parts, or it didn't have that kind of underground industrial military base feel to it. So what I did is I ended up searching a lot of pictures of bunkers up, especially military bunkers. And what I noticed is that a lot of them use concrete walls. A lot of times it's concrete walls, floor, ceiling, and then a lot of like metal pipes. So I did add the concrete walls and ceiling, and I did add the metallic pipes, which are actually as you can see right over there. But I did use a very different texture for the flooring than shown in a lot of those pictures. Now the reason is because of these submarines. If this type of place did exist in underwater military base that could be accessed by submarines, I would think that drainage is very necessary for an area like this, especially with such direct access to water. So you want water to be able to drain out when people are coming out of the submarines, out of the water. If anything like that, there's water going to be splashing over the sides. So that really needs to drain. And I've kind of added this throughout the entire base to kind of show that, like, if this was a real location, there wouldn't really be any water buildup. Now, this is the only staircase that the player can actually go up, and when they actually reach this area, a trigger event is set off that has these enemies coming out and attacking the player. Now, the player is actually able to use the staircase and this barrier to like dodge the shots uh, from the enemy. Right over here is the next hallway. This is actually the hallway that leads to barracks and leads to other parts of the map. But as you can see, a large part of the area is actually blocked off, and that was done in the attack. Now, the only place that the player will have to go through the barracks to actually go to this area. But if they look here, they can actually see that there is rooms that they're able to access right over there. Now, once they reach this area, trigger events are set off where the dogs will attack the player and jump out of them. And as you can see, I've died. It's possible to go through this entire map without dying. I've done it multiple times, and I've had playtesters also be able to end the map without dying. I actually just went on God mode to show it. But because of the way I am playing through it to try to actually explain the entire gameplay process, the entire like map and textures, I am not paying as much attention as I should to actually the enemies around the map, and I am taking a lot of very reversible damage. Now, even if the player doesn't pick up these items in the secret areas, they can still really get through them. there are a lot of secret areas that like open right in front of the player's sightline, like the ones under the staircase right over there, and one that I'm actually about to approach. So this enemy is actually supposed to jump out at the player when they get around here. And when they actually succeed in beating the enemy, they are able to obtain a gun from a secret area that opens right there. Now, I want to take a short break from the actual fighting to talk about the textures and the hallways right over here. So, the hallways, as you can see, are very kind of plain. They don't have a lot of details. And the reason is because after searching around like pictures of bunkers, I realized that the construction is very purposeful and I kind of wanted to represent that in my map. So, even though there are living quarters in this area, like the barracks that you can see, this isn't a place intended to be home. A lot of the players that are living here are living here, or a lot of the people living here are living here temporarily. They're here for while they're working and then they leave. And so I don't want this to have the feel of a place that could be lived in. Instead, it's very industrial. It's supposed to have the feel of like you come here to work, and that's kind of done with the walls here, and also just even using the concrete texture of the wall. It's supposed to be represent that it's very stable, it's very sturdy. It's a place that's going to be around for long periods of time, even when people that live here are not. And even with that, the intention is it's like a lot of these types of areas because they're underground and they don't have access to lighting from outside. Time passes very feels like it passes very differently, where you're unaware whether it's night or day. And that's kind of seen a little bit through the, first of all, lack of windows throughout the map, but also through these long hallways that look very similar to each other, where this just feels like a space outside of the rest of the world. So there's more enemies down here. And I actually chose ranged enemies because with I didn't want to have melee enemies that are very close to the player. Um, and the reason for that was if with like multiple melee enemies, they would have to be right in the corner right over here to actually be able to cause damage for the player. Instead, I wanted the player to have to attack the enemies from a long way off. Now, the player can actually use the corner of the hallway here to actually dodge most attacks. Now, when the player enters this area, they actually are able to see two enemies here. Right here, this is the Armory, where the player is able to get some supplies. Now, this is the first place that the player is actually directed to, but they aren't able to access the safe automatically. And the reasoning for that is when I show you the security room, the player has to be able to actually pick up the player is actually directed to the security room because they aren't able to open up the safe. Now this room is also to let the player pick up some health and armor. The player can actually duck in here when they're fighting the melee enemies and actually get items in here, which is another interesting use of this room. Um, I like the idea of having shelves here, mostly because I could display these items that the players can pick up in a very interesting way, but also to kind of create interesting movement when fighting the enemies, where the players are actually able to duck behind the shelves to hide from attacks, but also shoot the enemy through the gaps. Now, I also kind of wanted to keep this area pretty dark, and that was because I thought it'd be really interesting to have the shelves kind of cast shadows, but also especially in areas and corners like here where the enemies kind of fly down and duck below, it is pretty hard to spot them, making the fighting a lot more challenging. So when the player actually approaches this, if just is safe, they find out that they actually need a key. So they are actually directed to next room. Right over here, they need a gold key. So this is the security room where the player is able to obtain a couple more items right over here. Some armor, and uh, some armor and some ammo and a key. Now, so there were some knights right there. That uh, with the trigger, they are actually supposed to come out and attack the player when they enter the room, but because some of my attacks actually were hitting the knights that actually stood in this corner right over here, they did come outside. So even though this is the final kind of version of the map, that is actually something I do want to update. Uh, because this is a map that I will continue to work on even after its release, to just kind of see how I've been improving previously. So after obtaining the key, the player can actually enter the safe where they can gain a bunch of really helpful weapons and a very good set of armor, and of course the key that will let them head into this room, which is actually the final area that the player can fight in. Now, there are a lot of different types of enemies here. There's a lot of range enemies and enemies that are actually able to fight as melee enemies. Now, the trick here is to kind of avoid being caged in. You kind of have to use your surroundings. The best way to do that is actually using, as you can see, you can cause damage to the other enemies with the enemies available in the map, and actually prevent damage from happening to yourself. Now, a great way to actually fight in this area is actually using this testing table right over here to dodge a bunch of attacks. As you can see, these purple beams are actually being blown up also by the corners of the table. So that's a really good way to actually not get damaged from them. It is very tricky to do, but it can be done, and I have actually done a couple times. As you can see, I'm continuously being chased by this. Uh, so this actually makes that the final boss, and as you can see, that just went off. So this is the final area of the room, which is actually a testing facility where the outbreak actually happened. And I wanted to kind of exhibit that through the cages that are open that contain still some enemies that are reside in them, but also through this giant cage right over here where the door has been blown off, and it's actually where the escape first started and infested the rest of the map area. Uh, so that is actually the final area of the map, and I just wanted to, show a little bit, talk a little bit more, so I don't have the end sequence playing out right now. But right over here, I forgot to mention, there was some ammo and some health, and that's to prepare the player for the final battle. I did not want to add too much because the player did just pick up some items previously, but that's also just to replenish any health or ammo that is necessary. The player can also duck out of these rooms and grab some items right over here if they're very low on health or ammo. And this is also done as a kind of warning, like, hey, there's going to be a huge fight coming up. Here are some items. There's also the intended purpose for the armory, where the player is actually able to obtain a lot of items that will actually help in their survival of the fight. Now, the armory is a necessary. These two rooms are actually a necessary area of the map for the player to go to. They can't go to each room. Now, they do have the choice to actually be able to choose which room that they do want to go into first. But either way, it is going to be necessary for the player to enter both rooms. Now, with the barracks, I wanted to add enemy placements. The reason why I added dogs in these corners right over here is because of the spaces between the beds. I thought it limits the sightline of any enemies in the map, but also allows for the dogs to actually jump out and attack the player. Now, because I knew where they were, it was a lot easier for me to be aware of them and to shoot them down. But previously noticed from playtesting, a lot of times many the playtesters that actually not notice the dogs until they were passed, and they would turn around because they were taking damage. So that just makes this part of the map a bit more challenging. Um, and so this is gonna be the final map I created for Inferno Labs. There are 3 secret areas all throughout the map, which I did show, which is the storage closet, the underwater area, and the one in the barracks. And so the player is actually able to complete this map without actually finding any of these secret areas. Uh, it does become a lot more challenging though. The player does have to rely a lot on the ammo, which is why there's a lot ammo placement throughout the map, even though that is not always completely necessary. But the strong type of guns make it a lot easier to run through the map. But it is possible to play through this entire map without actually picking up any of the shotguns or nail guns throughout it. It just does make it a lot faster to go through the rest of the map. And that is all.